Be inspired, supported, and empowered. This is the Global Healthy Living Foundation podcast network.
Prior to migraine, I had a really big career, and everyone who has chronic migraine feels that loss of their past life, and I definitely have experienced that.
Welcome to Talking Head Pain, a podcast that confronts head pain head on. I'm Joe Koh, Director of Education and Digital Strategy at GHLF. I've lived with migraines for over 20 years, so I understand what it can do to your life. Today, I have the delight to talk to Cannon, otherwise known as the Migraine Babe on TikTok. Cannon shares how migraine impacted her career and how she's using social media now to support others living with migraine. So really nice to meet you, Cannon. Where are you from?
I am from Fort Worth, Texas. I split my time between a farm and Fort Worth growing up as a child. And I had a really kind of idyllic childhood with chickens and goats and cows and peacocks and horses.
And how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. It's been a busy day. It's been a productive day, but I had a good walk at lunch, went to the park with my dog, and we had some good times. And here I am now talking to you.
So we're going to be talking about head pain for Talking Head Pain. I would love for you to talk about what migraine means to you and your worst migraine attack.
Migraine for me is so much more than head pain. It is a neurological disease and it is a dysfunction of the nervous system. And my life with migraine is quite different than most because I have chronic hemiplegic migraine, which is one of the rarest subtypes of migraine with aura. In terms of my worst migraine attack, I've had some different varieties. I've had some big slammies, as I like to think of them, or big baddies, where I will pass out. That happens about once a year. Once I was in California, I passed out in the UCLA Santa Monica emergency room. Really nice emergency room there. They have private rooms and they turn out the lights. It's the nicest emergency room I've ever been to. But I also passed out in New York several times. I've done it at urgent care. I've done it at home on the floor in the bathroom. I've done it in the emergency room. I also get cyclic vomiting during these big baddies. That's when I typically would need an IV to rehydrate. So that's pretty tough. My scariest attack was a hemiplegic attack that really closely mimicked a stroke. I usually know the difference between my hemiplegic attacks and a stroke because when you have hemiplegic migraine, you know to kind of look for these symptoms and you see how they kind of act in stages and phases and you know when to act fast. So this was one where everything happened instantaneously and it just was like snap. My words slurred, everything seemed warped. I had paralysis. I couldn't smile, and being unable to smile was a new symptom for me. So as soon as you have a new symptom during one of these episodes or attacks, that's when like the little spidey senses go off and you know that you have to pay attention. And because this was happening instantaneously and because I had this new symptom where I was unable to smile, I knew that I needed to get it checked out to rule out stroke because I know that I had such a high risk of stroke. So I called 911 and the EMTs came and my blood pressure was super duper high. I usually have really low blood pressure. They were like, yeah, we're pretty sure you're having a stroke. And the ambulance drove me the one block to the hospital because I live one block away from the hospital. And the stroke team was ready for me. And that one took a while to recover from, but I returned to baseline that day. The IVs worked and everything. Usually my auras come in stages and phases, but I have intractable auras. So I have auras all the time. I haven't been without some level of hemiplegic migraine auras since 2015, but those were kind of my worst migraine attacks.
So interesting for me right now personally, because I live with migraine, as you may know, and I've been getting more dizziness and close to fainting. And my tingly spider senses went off and I spent a day in the ER recently. And we also have private ER rooms in Rockland County. Who knew? But we do.
Oh,
and they turn
the
lights off for me, which is really nice. Once you got out of the actual ER waiting room into a room, it was very good. So it's important what you're saying when you feel something different to take notice and to get help. Do you find that a lot of people struggle with going to the ER or taking a new symptom seriously because we don't want to be seen as like exaggerating or being dramatic?
Absolutely. And there's so many times when I don't want to go. I will go to urgent care so many more times than I will go to the ER just because I never want to put too much stress on the emergency staff, especially right now in the middle of a pandemic. And I also don't want to put myself at risk. But I do find that I will avoid going to the emergency room as much as possible. And usually the reason I go is because my neurologist sends me. She sent me in April because she wanted to rule out a blood clot because I had developed a new aura and it was kind of mimicking a blood clot. So she wanted to rule that out, and NYU is super duper careful. And so she was like, you need to go right now. And I did. And it was fine. There was nothing wrong. It was just another aura. That's just how it is.
Cannon, you've mentioned auras now 2 or 3 times. Can you explain what an aura looks and or feels like for you?
When most people think of migraine auras, they imagine the visual auras. So seeing flashes of light or seeing black or brown spots, having some sort of impairment with their vision. That is the one aura that I don't get a lot of. I think at the end of the day, when I close my eyes, I kind of have this disco show going on. But other than that, I don't really have visual auras. My auras are more motor and sensory. I have a lot of paresthesia. I have constant paresthesia or tingling in my legs, primarily from the knees down. I also will get paresthesia in my hands and on my face. And then I get ataxia, which is kind of having difficulty walking and with movement and feeling really weak. I call it baby giraffe trying to drink water legs, if you have that visual. And I have a lot of difficulty walking. Some of my other auras now I'm trying to think, I will get a stutter. I have a terrific stutter and I will stutter through anything. And then I also get transient aphasia, which is when I will have difficulty thinking of words or I mix up words. And I do this all the time. And because I have intractable auras, these symptoms are some things that I live with every second of the day. And I have lived with every second of the day since 2015.
Auras can be part of migraine in a big way. So I asked Dr. Peter McAllister, a board-certified neurologist and the director of the New England Center for Neurology, to describe some of the most common types of aura.
The most common aura is a visual aura. That is having 20 to 30 minutes of zigzags if it's in the sensory section of the brain. But the less common ones are very interesting and can be quite scary. The second most common aura, if it's in the sensory section of the brain, is a tingling or numbness. And that can be one side of the body, can go up to the face, can involve half the tongue, which certainly can be very scary. And a lot of folks think they're having a stroke. One can also have the aura in the motor cortex. That presents very stroke-like with weakness. And there is a subset of migraine called hemiplegic migraine, where one side of their body gets weak. One can have the aura in the dizzy and balance center. One can have it in the language center. So these are neurological symptoms that are not dangerous, fully reversible, and part of the migraine in about a third of those who have migraine disease.
It's really important for people to understand that auras can be all these multifaceted things that happen to people and not only a visual representation. I've learned that from people with epilepsy, that it could be like a feeling of deja vu or something like that. And I think it's important for people to acknowledge that because it helps us better manage our disease if we understand that this weird feeling is part of migraine.
Absolutely. And I do get this strange bit of tingling or twinginess, as I like to call it, on the right side of my head. And that's usually my first indicator. I'm tingling all over all the time. It can be difficult for me to distinguish one from the other. And a lot of times I like to keep moving and I like to keep busy. So I'll just keep trucking along until I realize that I can't walk or talk. And then I'm kind of like, oh boy, it's time for me to take my meds.
I heard that you had to travel a lot because of migraine and potentially your career. Can you talk about how it's navigating employment and travel with migraine?
Prior to migraine, I had a really big career, and everyone who has chronic migraine feels that loss of their past life. And I definitely have experienced that. And it's heartbreaking to see who you were before your chronic illness and who you become and all of the experiences and all of those things that you lose as a result. And so after I kind of was used to working again and I had adopted some healthy work-life balance habits and all of those things, I got a job in New York, back in the fashion industry, working for an American designer in the city. And I was with that designer for several years before there were COVID layoffs. And once I was back in New York, I was assigned a headache specialist at NYU, and I've been with her since. And she has been absolutely incredible. I was freelancing at the time. I had lost my job due to migraine, and I just packed up my place and I moved to California. I saw that UCLA had started a migraine program. I knew that UCLA was one of the top neurological hospitals in the country. And while I was at NYU, which is another top neurological hospital, I just wanted to see if a change of pace, a different lifestyle could be helpful for me. And what I learned in being a patient at UCLA, their approach to patient care is very different than NYU's. They feel much more clinical. But what they really did is they taught me that my approach to treating migraine didn't have to be reliant upon just one preventive medication. I needed to target all of these different symptoms. And there was nothing wrong in needing to take multiple medications and get Botox and try different kinds of diets and do meditation. And so I kind of had this catalog of things that I was doing to manage migraine. And since I was unable to work at that time, I did everything to optimize my life for migraine. They taught me more about preventive medications and how these different medications could address my symptoms than any other place. The effect that it had on my life was transformational. I no longer needed to wear sunglasses inside. I was not as light sensitive as I usually was. I wasn't as sensory sensitive, so I wasn't as sensitive to any other levels of senses, including loud noises, other things. I still am very sensitive to flashing lights and vibration, but other things don't trigger me so much. It took my daily pain from being at like a 7, it took my daily baseline pain to a 4. We looked at it and what are some different symptoms and how can we target those symptoms with preventive medication? And so that's how my headache specialist here in New York and I approach it as well. Once I got my symptoms under control in California, I was able to apply for a job and I got a job working for a communications firm. And it was a really simple job. I was way too qualified for it. And I've been very lucky to have access to both UCLA and NYU. And one of the reasons I work so dang hard is so that I can continue getting the care that I have at NYU because I need that insurance. I can just get very angry when I think about our medical healthcare system. But I work really hard so that I can stay with my doctors and get the treatments I need to treat this really gnarly disease.
What makes you angry about the healthcare system? You talked about getting angry. Get angry with me. What angers you?
I get so frustrated. There are only 700 headache specialists for at least 35 to 40 million people who have been diagnosed with migraine. There's probably more in the U.S. who have migraine and they don't even know it. And there's only 700 headache specialists to treat them. I have more access and more privilege than most. And it is so unfair that so many people don't have access to the medications they need. It is so unfair that they don't have access to the treatments they need. I want to punch the wall when I think about step therapies and what the, insurance companies make patients go through in order to get a G-pant, which won't put them into rebound. Everything about it seems to set migraine patients up for failure. I was so lucky that I lived in New York and had access to NYU. Had I been in my hometown of Fort Worth, I don't know if I would have been able to function. I don't know if I would have been able to ever maintain a career or have any of the opportunities that I have had in working with my last job in fashion, producing all of the social media behind fashion shows, going on work trips to Spain, all of those different things. I never would have been able to do that. I probably would be put on one medication and I wouldn't have been able to walk out the door, which is how it is for so many people. NYU has an entire appeals team. They work on all the prior authorizations. My doctor doesn't even work on it. There's a team that does it. I have access to these medications and I'm able to live this life, but most people don't. And so that's why I started my TikTok account, was to share so much of what I've learned to people who don't have the access and privilege that I have.
Well, we're going to get to TikTok. I have questions about that. So yeah, you were talking about prior authorizations and step therapy, or we call at GHLF, the Global Healthy Living Foundation, fail first hurts, because they force us to fail on something first and hurt before we get what we need. I remember calling my insurance company and they kept denying a very simple treatment because the doctor didn't check the right box. And then the doctor didn't give the right amount of information on how I failed on certain triptans. And I'm like, I finally said to the insurance company, can you tell me what the secret code is? Can you just tell me what magical combination of words that we need to say? My neurologist will do it. It's so frustrating. I, like you, have a lot of privilege and knowledge. And it's like, if I'm struggling to get access, I can imagine what someone who doesn't have the resources that I have or that you have struggles. So I'm right with you with that anger. Before we get to TikTok, I want to go back to your job, because I think it's important for folks to hear about that loss. And you talked about the loss of your past life and the loss of your job. What did that feel like, especially being a younger person? These are supposed to be like the best years of our career.
I think I was 32 when I was diagnosed with chronic migraine, and my career was skyrocketing. I had started social media for a luxury store in the city called Bergdorf Goodman, and I had done that for 5 years, and then I had accepted a job as the head of social for a startup. And that's when my migraine disease had kind of chronified and morphed into vestibular migraine, and the bottom just fell out. It was the most humbling time of my life. And usually when, I hear people now say that they're humbled when they get an award or when they're honored, I'm like, you have no idea what it's like to truly be humbled. Because when you lose the ability to walk and you have to have a physical therapist teach you how to walk down a hall again after you had the most fun life in the world, that's humbling. I also have gastroparesis, and the things they make gastroparesis and GI patients go through is truly humbling. And then also the whole process of going from having this big career and being in the press and going to parties all the time and having people contact me all the time and invite me to stuff, then just the silence of not really hearing from people. And so many of my friends and acquaintances no longer communicating with me because I wasn't trendy. That was humbling. Also, when I was able to get a job again, my salary was so much less. I think it was like a $40,000 pay cut the next job that I had just so I could start working again. That was incredibly humbling. And going from overseeing teams and having teams of people report into me and then being kind of back at the bottom of the totem pole, that was incredibly humbling. It took me 7 years to get my career back to where it was before migraine. And the job that I started in August, I'm back to overseeing teams and doing all of that. I worked at an agency before that as well. So I guess it took me about 6.5, 7 years to get back to this place. And to be making as much or more than what I was making when I was 32.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Important. What would you go back and tell your newly diagnosed self if you were able to?
I would really emphasize a headache specialist more than anything else because I just had a general neurologist. And I think had I had a headache specialist from the beginning, it may have prevented my migraine disease from becoming so gnarly. Unbeknownst to me, throughout my 20s, I likely had chronic migraine. It was migraine without aura, but I thought it was sinus infections. And in hindsight, when I think about it, it's now very obvious to me because I was throwing up and my head hurt and it was constant. I was using over-the-counter meds daily and likely was a medication adaptation headache. And my general practitioner at the time just would thump on my sinuses and tell me that I had a sinus infection. Had he known how to recognize migraine back then, I would not be in the situation that I'm in today. So I think getting proper care as early as possible is so critical.
What Cannon's bringing up here is really important. So I asked Dr. McAllister to explain why migraine attacks often get misdiagnosed as sinus infections or sinus headaches and how we can tell the difference.
There was a study from the Mayo Clinic some years ago that took patients who thought they had recurrent sinus headache or were told, in fact, by their primary care or other doctors that they had sinus headache. And they had them see both a board-certified headache specialist and an ear, nose, and throat doctor. They had scans of their sinuses, they had scopes put up their nose, etc. And it turned out that 9 out of 10 of those who were diagnosed with sinus headache did not have sinus headache, and the vast majority were, in fact, migraine. And here's the overlap. A good minority of migraine sufferers will develop what we call parasympathetic drive. What that simply means is it's a turn on of not just pain nerves, but nerves that actually line the sinus cavity and are in the nose. And so if one has a socked in pressure feeling around the eyes, the midface, or the nose, they tend to go there and say, oh, that must be sinus. Not realizing that the bad nerve in migraine is the trigeminal nerve. Well, the trigeminal nerve supplies the sinuses and supplies sensation to the nose and around the eyeballs and the upper teeth. So when that turns on, one can feel like a sinus headache. The fact is, if you look at the ENT literature, sinus headache is not a severe one. It's usually focused over the medial aspect of the eyebrow. And it's usually associated with other symptoms of acute rhinosinusitis, such as snot coming out your nose, swollen glands, malaise, blood tests that would show an elevated white count, a low-grade fever. If you don't have those things, and these are recurrent, you have migraine by and large. And I have had, here's an extreme case, asking a woman in my office in a new consult if she has migraine, and she said no, but I have sinus headache every month around my menstrual period. And of course, a bit of education led her to understand that that pressure feeling in her midface and nose was actually a menstrual migraine.
There are so many people being misdiagnosed and so much general misinformation on migraine all over the internet. So Cannon decided to use her social media presence to help people get facts. You're the Migraine Babe on TikTok. And can you talk a little bit more about what Migraine Babe means to you and why you created this account and why you use TikTok?
I created the TikTok account for several reasons. One, I've been involved in migraine advocacy on social media since around 2016. I've worked in social media since 2009, so it's a very comfortable space for me. And in 2016, I helped run the group Migraine Strong, and I did that for several years. So I have a lot of background in migraine education and helping communities with migraine. I took some time to myself just because it got to be self-care, essentially. And as I was going on to TikTok to study the platform, to see what it's like because I work in social media, I would see so much misinformation about migraine. And the accounts that I was seeing getting a lot of visibility were accounts that were pushing things that don't have any peer-reviewed studies confirming whether or not these treatments are effective. It was a lot of holistic, quote unquote, cures. Here's a migraine cured juice, which would be ginger and a lot of sugary fruits and maybe some spinach in there. And that was supposed to cure a migraine attack. And I know that there are people who swear that it helps them. And then, other people are saying it's placebo, but there's nothing that's showing that this is helpful. So I wanted to create a space that was actually sharing accurate information. I think at the time I only found one pain management doctor who was giving out accurate information about migraine, but he constantly referred to it as headache. And that just made me so angry because headache is just one of the symptoms of migraine disease. And so I had all of this information in my head. So I just had to kind of get over my own video insecurity and being shy on camera and think of a way to communicate migraine facts to a community. It took a while, and then I realized that I don't know if it's horrible or if they relate to it, but people really love to see when I get my hemiplegic migraine attacks. And it's really easy for me to record because I've worked in social for so long, and all you have to do is like prop your phone up against a lamp and hit record and edit it later when you're not feeling so bad. And because my attacks are so physical, it's impactful. And so it's a way of showing that migraine is much more than what you think of. I mean, yes, I am so much of a migraine stereotype in that I'm a white woman, but often people had that image of a woman kind of holding her head and her brows are furrowed in pain. And my attacks are not like that at all. I can't really walk. I can't speak clearly. I can't hold on to things. And so this is a way of dispelling so many of these misinformation about migraine and misinterpretations of what migraine is. And also for the hemiplegic migraine community, because that's a much smaller community, and people who are just diagnosed with hemiplegic migraine, it is so scary. And to see that you can have hemiplegic migraine and be active, and you can have hemiplegic migraine and be productive. And so those were some of the reasons I started it, and it's kind of grown from there. And I have built this lovely little community of people who now really want the facts and they want the research. And I dedicate almost all of my free time to research. I'm not a researcher. I'm not a scientist, but I am constantly reading NIH studies. I am listening to all of the podcasts that I can about migraine disease. I am going back and I'm listening to videos from the Migraine World Summit. It is so important that I share accurate information because I know so many of these people, they don't have a headache specialist. And so I want to be able to give them the tools that they need to self-advocate, because at least if they're going to their GP, they can say, here's a study that is talking about this medication that can be really effective. I'm interested in this. Can we have a conversation about it?
Was there anything that I didn't cover that you feel is very important?
One thing we didn't really go through is how genetic migraine is. I think a lot of people forget that. And I know a lot of advocates are trying now to change the language, rightfully so, to migraine and migraine disease rather than using migraine in the plural when referring to attacks. Because the more we talk about migraine in the singular and as a disease, the more that society will see it as such and will begin to understand that this is something that is primarily genetic. Yes, you can get migraine from comorbidities or from TBIs, but primarily it is something that runs in the family. And I think what's so critical about that is because of the misinformation surrounding migraine, oftentimes people think that migraine is this isolated incident that happens due to something that you did to yourself. And it is so important that migraine patients, especially those who are new to migraine, whether it's episodic or chronic migraine, that they know that migraine is not their fault. And there's nothing that they did in their life to cause migraine disease. Yes, there are triggers that we have and that can provoke an attack, but the disease is there regardless.
One of the first things I did as an official advocate for migraine, and I didn't want to come out publicly with migraine. I thought it would impact my career. I thought there was a time that I thought I might run for office. And I'm like, will they use that against me and say I'm weak and I won't be able to do it? One of the first things I wrote as an advocate was an article called, What If Life Was the Trigger? Because everyone's saying, well, if you do this or if you do that, to your point earlier, Cannon, I think we feel and we internalize as migraine patients a lot of these feelings that we are in control of this disease in some way. And in some way we are. We can manage things differently in some ways, but in a lot of ways, in most ways, we probably can't. And we can't beat ourselves up about that. So I want to leave our listeners with something to remind ourselves about being compassionate to each other and using our skills like we have seen you use, Cannon, your social media skills, your calling. You found your way to advocate and you're using it for good. And we all have a skill and we have something to give. And what can we give to make this world a better place? And I think that's what people get from listening to your story and the work that you do. So I so appreciate your time and energy being on here today.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. This has been quite a delight and an honor.
Thanks for listening to Talking Head Pain, a podcast that confronts head pain head on. If you enjoyed this episode, give us a rating and write a review on Apple Podcasts. It'll help more people like you find us. I'm Joe Coe, and we'll see you next time. This season of Talking Head Pain is made possible with support from Amgen, sponsor of the Global Healthy Living Foundation.
Be inspired, supported, and empowered. This is the Global Healthy Living Foundation podcast network.